to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome to the God Conclusion. Today, as our guest, we have Richard Wayne Garganta. Richard had published an article that I read, but I did not catch the name of the television program that you host.
That's public access. I recently, as of I think it was about 2 weeks ago, I'm switching everything over to YouTube, so you don't have to spend any more time on that. I haven't just changed the website yet.
Okay, fair enough. Richard, I think, is a pretty new visitor to the God Conclusion Facebook page. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, his attention was drawn by one of the memes I posted about straight pride, which created quite a firestorm on the page. And when I started having a dialogue with Richard, I noticed that he had written an article called "Is Gay Prejudice Taught in the Bible?" And I read that article in the most recent few hours. And now Richard and I are going to discuss the article. So welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And we talked a little bit before the show. This is not going to be an adversarial conversation.
Correct.
It's going to be a friendly dialogue. If I'm going to apologize in advance if I say anything, if I phrase my questions poorly, it's due to my lack of preparation time. It's not because I'm trying to set up a gotcha question or anything like that. But in start, Richard got his article got off to a good start. He made reference to the Westboro Baptist Church in their God Hates Gay campaigns. And I think most reasonable Christians would agree that those are abhorrent, that they not only chose to put such an inflammatory message out in public view, but to do it at the military funerals of fallen soldiers. I thought that was well beyond the pale. And I'm going to jump back to conclusion and then go forward again. I know that we agree on a couple of things. I'm not going to try to put any words into Richard's mouth or anything of that nature, but I think that we agree that Christ is the truth, and we're just seeking truth here today. And so with that in mind, there was one thing that you wrote in this article, and this was like a 31-page article. It was 32 pages, I think. Very interesting reading. And the purpose of the article was to understand what the Bible really says, as opposed to what other people are telling us that the Bible says. There was a quote that I thought was controversial that I think we'll start with. You said that Jews survived by not following the law as it was written. What, and I'm trying to read my own handwriting, weren't Jews punished when they didn't follow the law?
That depends. For instance, there's a lot of death penalties in the Jewish law. And if they were followed, they would also be killing their own children, because it mentions that if a child is wayward and so forth, they could, depending upon the severity of the crime, they could have them killed. It's like the way we deal with law today. You may commit a crime and there can be an offense that might have a death penalty, but most people don't get it. If the Jews killed each other at the frequency that the Mosaic law demanded, the Jews would not have survived as a race, because the death penalty was applied to just about every single law that they had in one form or another, except for some lighter laws that had lesser penalties. So that was my point. Anyone that knows Jewish history knows that if the death penalty was going to be executed, you had to go through series of councils. It wasn't like you could find Johnny in the backyard doing something wrong and just go out and kill him. That's not the way it was executed at all. You had to go through several councils in order to get that approval. And I defy many people to find many examples in scripture where parents did kill their children.
You also in the article make the point that most of the Old Testament law was not from God per se, it was actually written by Moses. And you make reference correctly to Jesus in the New Testament saying that divorce did not ever come from God, that it came from Moses. So the law, as defined by Moses, is not purely God's word. It's been corrupted by or tainted by human influence. Would you agree with that?
I would, yes, absolutely. I think Jesus made that clear.
And this leads into this whole discussion of sexuality. And again, I think at the end of the day, we'll probably agree more than we disagree, but I can't guarantee that. But you, there's a historical context that you make reference to. You talk about how cross dressing made theft easier. If a male dressed as a female, he would be able to get away with stealing. So that's why what would be now called transvestitism, I think, would be forbidden or was forbidden by the ancient Jewish law. But it wasn't because of the sexual nature of it, it was because of the criminal element to.
Well, pretending to be something you were not was a lie. And if you were dressing as a woman to get into, say, or rather, if you were a woman dressing as a man to get into places that men were allowed, keep in mind, we're dealing with societies that were very sexually. That was a form of deception. And according to the research that I have done, that was the main reason why it was condemned. And my backup for that is Philo or Philo, however you say the name, who wrote on the Decalogue and the Ten Commandments. He was a first century Hellenistic Jew, and he explains many of the prohibitions in the Old Testament and the reasons for them initially.
Very good. In your article, you say that there are the number one priority, according to Old Testament canon, was reproduction, took precedence over everything. And you mentioned that even gay people in the Old Testament times would be expected to procreate with their brother's widow should the brother pass away without providing offspring.
Hmm.
But then the second priority is to obey laws only on the Ten Commandments. I apologize. I've just got these notes scribbled down and I'm trying to read
I
through them
understand.
as we're talking. And
I was surprised you were able to finish it that quickly, actually.
I was fascinated. And that would probably be the best thing is if I tried to talk to you more naturally than just reading from the notes. But you covered so much material that I don't want to forget anything. So I'm going to try to go back to a more of a dialogue, but then I'll look down to my notes periodically. You mentioned that the only unforgivable sin is blasphemy against the Holy Spirit. I agree with you 100% on that. But what isn't clear is, do you feel like or do you believe that according to the Old Testament and the New Testament, that homosexuality is a sin?
It's a sin?
Is a sin.
No, not necessarily at all. And first, let me clarify something because of today's society and what we're going through in today's society. There's such a thing now as sex changes and all of that. My article focuses strictly on same sex attraction. That's it. I'm not talking about sex changes. I'm not talking about even a man who feels like they're a woman inside or vice versa. I'm not talking about that. I'm simply talking about same sex attraction. When I wrote that article, it seems like the brevity of the subject has just exploded beyond what my original article was designed to address. I see condemnations of homosexual behavior And if you want to use the Bible to decide what's condemned, I could give you a host of things that were condemned that would not be considered sin at all today. Wearing mixed
Oh yeah,
fabric,
eating
eating
shellfish,
shellfish,
wearing
uh,
polyester, all
yeah,
the
traveling more
typical.
than 10 miles on the Sabbath. I could go on. I don't know if it's 10 miles, but there was a limit on what you could travel, starting a fire on the Sabbath. So you really have to put it into context, which is what I hope my article did as to what we should consider wrong. We got to look back at why they considered it wrong and also why the whole Jewish law was thrown out. There was the whole law of Moses was done away with. So to try to use the Old Testament to decide what's sin today, I think we need to evaluate and keep it more along the lines of the Ten Commandments. And in the Ten Commandments, I don't see anything against homosexuality. There are people in history, throughout history, that have same-sex attraction as far back as Genesis. And I've talked to many people from Israel and so forth. And I've even said to them, what do you feel about, given your Jewish background, what do you feel about homosexuals? And they say, anyone who finds out that somebody's homosexual tells them, you go out and you reproduce, at least have one child. That is your purpose on earth. After that, do what you want to do. That's basically what the Jews think. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but
It got to the gist of the question, I think, overall. And before we go any further, for the benefit of the audience, I'd like to say I am relatively certain that you are not coming at this issue with an agenda. I believe that you're a heterosexual male, and you explained your rationale in this article for having the change of mind or having the revelation that you can't necessarily condemn homosexual marriage because you had a friend who is gay who for health issues had to be married in order to be able to receive benefits according to law. The law is now mandating that gays be married. So if that's the case, then how can we say that gay marriage is wrong? But I know that you and I also agree that no church should be forced to perform a gay marriage against their beliefs. It should be
absolutely.
voluntary. So I know that in the case of Jack Phillips and the Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, you would support his right, his freedom to say, I don't want to be involved in this. But it's not wrong for everybody necessarily. You need to let your conscience guide you.
Exactly. Now, I believe and still teach that the marriage between a man and a woman can be classified as a biblical marriage. That is when the state and the church were married. They were one and the same. Marriage is a legal, separate from the church institution. You get married by going to a city hall and paying for a marriage license. And when you drop that money down and they stamp that piece of paper, you are legally married by the state. It is not a church or religious marriage. So the whole debate over whether it's biblical or not biblical is irrelevant to me because the state is now the arbitrator of who gets married and who does not. And they can be two drug addicts, they can be whatever, they can be two sinners, whatever, and go down to City Hall and pay that money. And when that thing is stamped, they are legally married. So I have no problem with people saying it's not a biblical marriage, but it is a civil marriage. And we have both now. You can do both. After you go to City Hall, then you can go into a church and make it biblical if your church so allows it. So to me, that whole issue has to be looked at in the reality of today.
I agree. And I agree that the law requires it, so you really can't get around it. But to force churches to do it is just as wrong as for us to say arbitrarily, under no circumstances should gay marriages ever be considered because the Bible says one thing. I'm not necessarily sure. I'm going to have to, for the sake of this conversation, assume that all the terms that you used in the paper and all the references that you made are accurate, and I have no reason to believe otherwise. You had some interesting observations on pederasty in the definition. To me, that almost implies pedophilia, but you explained very carefully and very precisely that that's not what it meant back in those days. But it
Well,
still wasn't a.
with
I'm sorry. Go
pederasty,
ahead.
you're talking about a higher age limit. We're not talking about pedophilia. Pedophilia is sex with children. Pederasty is sex with teenagers or higher. So nobody was, as a form of sexual education, was something that was done in almost all the Greco-Roman world. And I'm glad you brought that up because it's not the same as pedophilia. There is a difference.
But it's easy to confuse the
Oh,
words.
God, yeah, yes, it is. And this is a subject that's not even taught or even known about in most churches.
Another thing that we don't talk about in church as much anymore are the eunuchs,
Yes,
and you talk about them as well.
I do.
But my question is, it sounds like in the article that you're saying it isn't really, or it isn't for everybody. And I probably agree with that statement, that celibacy is not an alternative to homosexuality for everybody. And there's a lot of, in fact, you have earlier in the article, you had a spectrum where you were talking about bisexuality. And I didn't really understand what you were saying when you said that everyone is bisexual. Could you explain that for me a little bit?
I said
Um,
everybody was bisexual.
I
I think,
probably am misreading what you said because I was trying
yeah,
to.
a little bit. What I did was I made a graph, I believe, as flimsy as it was, of purely heterosexual on one side and totally gay on the other side, and said that everybody it falls somewhere on this line in when they're born or as they mature they land somewhere, either they land in, as a heterosexual, they discover it, we discover our sexuality, it can't be taught, it's discovered, and at some age your body begins to tell you what you are, and some people end up on the gay the homosexual side, some people in the middle, and some people on the purely heterosexual side. That was my whole point. I don't believe, unless I got to go back and reread it,
You were
I don't believe.
probably being sarcastic, or I'm almost certain I was misreading it because, like I said,
Yeah,
I was trying.
I hope you were, but I have to go back and check on that. No, I'm saying that everybody falls somewhere in that line, and they fluctuate a little bit. There are some people that'll tell you they had a homosexual experience, maybe in the military or as a teenager, whatever, and that's it. They had it, it's over and done with, and they go back to whatever they were naturally. But for the point that I think I was making in that point in the article was it's not a choice. Your sexual, what turns your body on, what flicks that switch is not a choice. It's a biological switch that you have, and you really don't have a choice over it. You can hate it, as many people that are gay do. They hate themselves, they're depressed, they commit suicide at higher rates and so forth because they hate that switch that's in their brain. If a guy comes to me and says, you can make, oh, I know the statement you're talking about. If somebody comes to me and says, I'm bisexual, or rather, if they say sexuality is a choice, I say, then what you're telling me is you're bisexual. Because if you're telling me you can either be turned on by men or women, you're telling me you're bisexual. You can't, you see
Oh,
what I'm saying? That's the point that I was trying to make. People that think it's just a choice, why don't you just choose otherwise? That's not the way our bonds, our brains, and our bodies work. There are certain things that get the juices flowing and certain things that do not. And you don't have much choice over what they are. They're just there, they're discovered. And the common argument that homosexuals choose homosexuality, I'm sorry. I do not believe that at all. And I've talked to certainly enough of them and know enough of them to know it was not a choice. And most of them, if they could have made a choice, they would have made a different choice.
fair enough. Before I wrote the God conclusion and started the Facebook page and now started the podcast, a previous book that I'd written was called Counter Argument for God. And after I wrote that, I went and worked online for a website that's now defunct called examiner.com. And I wrote as the Atlanta Creationism Examiner. And when I was doing that, there was somebody in Dallas who was the, I don't want to say the gay examiner, but whatever her moniker was, it was obvious that she was declaring a homosexual lifestyle. And at that time, Lady Gaga had come out with that song "Born This Way," And so I asked her if it would be okay if I interviewed her. And she said yes. And we had a very pleasant conversation. And she told me that she believed, yes, that she was born to be gay, that her earliest proclivities were attracted toward the same sex instead of toward the opposite sex. And my approach is I believe what people tell me unless I have evidence that they're not telling me the truth. And without any evidence, I have to give her belief that's how she feels. But then later, I saw some research about that was coming from science, and they said that there was definitely no such thing as a gay gene, which could mean that nobody is truly born with a sexual proclivity of one sort or the other, but at some early stage, we develop these feelings for whatever reason. And on that spectrum that you had put in your article, I veer strongly to the right in that I've the only time I can remember any type of homosexual behavior was as a very young child touching me when I was trying to go to sleep and was like, get your hand off me, that kind of stuff. But it wasn't, I never had any kind of serious issues with that. And personally, on a personal level, I have gay family members. So when it comes to Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas dinners and things of that nature, of course, they're welcome in my home and they're welcome to bring their significant other. I'm not quite sure how I would deal with being invited to a gay marriage. I sit on the fence there and say, I know I'd send a gift, but I don't know if in good conscience I could attend the service. I go to the reception, I just not the service. But that's just my personal because I've always grown up with this mentality of the Bible condemns homosexuality. And when you're my age, it's hard to shake
That
these
may be
feelings.
your age or beyond. I don't know.
We are going to do a contest to see who's older because I'm not so sure I'd win. But again, this article that you wrote was very thorough, very well researched, and very interesting. And it did not leave anything open to the imagination. I wouldn't say it not open to the imagination, but it didn't leave any stones unturned in this debate. You addressed Sodom and Gomorrah. And I'd heard this argument before that the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were not condemned expressly for wanting to have homosexual relations with the angels. It was the lack of hospitality more than anything else. But I wonder because Sodom is the base word for sodomy,
Yeah.
is that just the historical naming convention error?
I wouldn't say it's an error. It's just let's not forget that Jerusalem was also destroyed in 70 AD, totally. So if you want to use the destruction of cities as an example to justify a particular prejudice, I think you need to look at Israel because Israel was probably judged more than Sodom ever was over the years. My One of the reasons that I wrote this article was because of the venom that I saw about towards homosexuals in the church. There was such a hatred. There was a hatred for it. And I kept wondering why this particular sin created such a hatred. And that's one of the reasons I wrote the article and mentioned about the gay prejudice and try to put it in biblical perspective. Because if you study biblical sexuality, they did a whole lot of things that we would not do today and that I would consider immoral. Multiple marriages, concubines, things like that were routine. They took over a nation, they took the men and the women as slaves and married them against their will. So there was all kinds of things that were done back then that wouldn't be done today. So we have to put it in perspective. So
My counter argument to that is that there's a lot in the Bible, but just because something's mentioned in the Bible does not mean God condones that behavior. The Bible talks about incest and human sacrifice, and a lot of different issues that we know that God abhors by reading scripture.
But
But
incest in the beginning was essential.
true.
That's why I say, you really got to study the history in Scripture. People tend to put blinders on, and they'll say, "Let's get married like they did in the Bible." I don't think you want to do that. They were prearranged marriages. You didn't necessarily pick your spouse; your family did because of a financial arrangement that you would make with the landowners around you. So when they people say, "Let's do it like they did in the Bible," that's why I wrote that article. Let's see how they did it in the Bible. I think there's a whole section in there on the 8 types of Bible marriages that there were.
Yes,
Yeah,
there
did I
is.
stick that in? Yeah, it wasn't just monogamous marriages that were ordered by God or Moses.
True, but that doesn't mean, once again, it doesn't mean that God approves of that behavior. It just
Well, that's how they
identifies.
ordered it. It says it wasn't "Thus saith Moses." This is "Thus saith the Lord." When it comes to the levirate, it was practiced. Let's put it that way. It was practiced and accepted by the Jewish religion and the leaders of the day, the church leaders of the day. Would you agree with that?
By and large, yes. I'm trying to read my notes again.
I understand. You're handling the questions very well, and very good questions considering the short time you had to read it.
I try to prepare, and I'm getting toward the end of my list of questions, so we're just going to be winging it here in a minute. In fact, in regard to polygamy, and I'm only going back to this because it's the last note that I've got written down here that I think I'm going to be making reference to for today. But in regards to polygamy, it is mentioned a number of times in the Bible, but God only made Eve for Adam.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
God only made Eve as a companion for Adam. He didn't make multiple wives.
That's right.
So to me, in the beginning, God made perfection, which is the union of one man and one woman.
Right.
And then they are to procreate, to multiply. And from there, the world gets populated. And
I have no problem with that. The Adam and Eve method is just fine for me.
that's why I say this is such an interesting conversation because you were defending an argument, and I'm not quite sure that I'm aggressively attacking that position. I know that I do have some concerns, but I feel like you've done an excellent job of presenting your case for this. And when it comes to the love and compassion that we see from Jesus in the Bible, he's a God. That's the message that's always being hammered home. You love your neighbor as yourself.
If I can
And
just interject, just in case, I am not a supporter of polygamy. I don't know if you misunderstood something I said, but
no,
oh,
I didn't think that. I think that in this article and in your
I
personal
discussed it.
beliefs, all you are defending is the right for gay people to be married,
Yes.
just like it is for heterosexual people to be married. And I think that you've got a reasoned and intelligent position that you're defending. And I'm just probing this position to understand it better because it doesn't conform with my existing worldview. But by the same token, we're here to seek truth, not to cling to our existing beliefs.
Yeah.
And in your article, you're not saying anything that I found just absolutely absurd.
And
I
did you expect that? I think you probably did, huh?
when you came to the page and you made some comments, some criticisms that were pointed, and because my post that I do believe attracted your attention was the straight pride post. And the whole point of that post is it's okay for straight people to still be proud of being
Hallelujah.
straight.
Absolutely.
We are both straight and we are both happy with being straight. We're trying to understand the ramifications of people who aren't straight, who are gay, who want to be in committed relationships. And I've been very reticent. I don't like throwing in outliers. So I know that somebody's going to out there is going to do some frantic research on the internet and they're going to find some reference to some gay couple that adopted a child and abused the child or put it in prostitution or something like that. There are horrible people,
Yes,
but there are horrible straight people too.
that's right.
And abuse is abuse. It doesn't
That's right.
matter if it's straight or gay.
Exactly. I've read your column for some time on Facebook, and I've also had an interest in your book, as I mentioned. I found it very interesting when I read up on it. You have discovered that when you bring up the matter of sexuality, a war breaks out because you have people that have been told all of their lives that they should not exist. And they have a problem with that because they exist.
Oh,
You know,
I have a friend, or I should say more specifically, he's a friend of my sister, but he's a friend by association. And I know for a fact that he's gay, and he's an atheist, and he's an atheist primarily because his mother told him, his own mother told him he was going to burn in hell. And I can't reconcile that thought in my head. I'll hope that my own son never watches this. But there was a time in my son's life where he showed very little interest in dating. And I wondered if he had gay tendencies. And it turns out he doesn't. But there was a point in time where he just didn't seem to have, he seemed to have more, mostly a celibate interest more than anything else. But he's just a very quiet and reserved guy in
hmm.
retrospect. But
Well,
when he was young,
we
sorry,
mentioned celibacy. That's one of the parts that bothered me, the way the church was handling homosexuals. They would say, if you're homosexual, then be celibate. Now, I couldn't be celibate. You know, I don't know. I'm assuming the same is true for you.
I would have had a very difficult time
Okay.
being celibate,
So
whether I was.
why would I want to put that on somebody else when I couldn't be celibate myself? Who do I think I am to tell somebody to live a lifestyle that I am not capable of living?
To be honest, I think that may be one of the reasons that the Catholic Church has such a problem with the priesthood.
I think you're right. I think that you hit the nail right on the head on that whole issue. And that's a very sad state of affairs.
It is. But those people are pedophiles, not just
Yes.
gay.
Yes. And there's no, I don't, and to me, and if I may address that issue because it troubles me so much, it's almost a perfect setup because a priest can go into the confessional and tell their friend priest what they did. And when they walk out of that confessional, it is as if they never did it. It's gone. They never did it. And that's a setup for serial pedophilia.
I agree with you there, but we don't need to get off onto the Catholic Church because that'll be another three
All right.
hour conversation
You can
easily.
edit that out, but you see how I feel about it.
I have some pretty strong feelings about the Catholic Church in both directions. On the one hand, I've said many times that if I ever come across a case of demonic possession that I'm convinced is real, I'm not even going to mess with anybody else. I'm going to go talk to a priest. If I had to convert to Catholicism to make that happen, if I was really dealing with a demon, I'd be sorely tempted to do that because they are the pros when it comes to dealing with that sort of stuff. But
I was raised.
I grew up
I was
Lutheran.
raised in charismatic Pentecostal movement. We have all kinds of professional exorcists in that.
I was raised as a Lutheran, and
Okay.
Lutherans are the original Protestants. And so, one of the reasons why Lutherans broke away from the Catholic Church was it had gotten so corrupt that even
Hmm.
in those days, they were
Right.
selling indulgences so that people could commit sins. Just like you were saying, you can go to confession and you can walk out, and it's like you never did it.
Right.
And that's wrong because you aren't supposed to go and do it again. That's what Jesus told the adulterous woman, go and sin no more. This is a very emotional topic for me because I left the Lutheran church because of a gay pastor. But what happened was the church that I grew up in down in Savannah, a gay pastor came into that church. And he wasn't just a gay pastor, he was an activist pastor. marched in the gay pride parade in Savannah, had all of his communion assistants and lay people and everything. They were all obviously gay people. And the church had been this one kernel of elderly people that had been in that congregation for 40 and 50 years. And then this new, smaller influx of people that was supporting the more gay friendly agenda of the new church. And one of the older people wasn't even complaining about the pastor, but complaining that everybody that was assisting was gay and promoting of that lifestyle. And he basically he told this woman, he excommunicated her from the church and told her that she wasn't welcome back anymore. She didn't have anywhere else to go. And that to me wasn't a loving approach either.
Hmm.
And I wrote to the bishop about that and expressed my concerns. And the bishop basically told me to take a hike. And I said, okay, I'll go to another faith. But I've never it's never been an issue of I'm die hard in my beliefs. Sometimes I feel like a tumbleweed. It depends on which way the wind's blowing, which direction
Hmm.
that my beliefs tend to go in that direction. When I read your article, I'm inclined to become much more sympathetic to people who want to be married who are gay. I don't personally, I've always said that a civil ceremony with a judge and everything should be fine, that churches shouldn't be compelled to provide that service if they believe that it's a religious union that God has ordained between one man and one woman according to biblical traditions.
If I can just interject something there, that whole issue of, in the example that I put in that, there was one state that said you had to be married in order to get the medical benefits. And the point is that when they studied this out, civil unions versus marriage, they discovered that they were not affording the same rights when it comes to Social Security, inheritance, so forth and so on. Civil unions didn't address any of that. They
Well, a
even
marriage, I'm sorry to interrupt, but a marriage by a judge is just considered a civil union?
some states were allowing civil unions, but not marriages. And when that was fought out in the court said you can't not give the same rights to both because a marriage is a civil, and people must understand this. A marriage is initially civil, whether you want it civil or not. You get a marriage license, although there are some ministers that won't get a marriage license and they consider themselves married. But the bottom line is a civil union did not give the same rights of inheritance. And I even know of a gay person who left all of their belongings to their husband. And when the person died, the family was able to come in and take everything because the husband had no rights because it was a civil union and not a marriage. So that's the sort of issues that were being raised when the issue of civil unions come out. And that's when the Supreme Court said, we have to rule on this. We have to decide whether it's going to be two separate things or it's going to be one and the same. And they went with marriage because they said there was no reason to create a second legal entity with less rights.
That seems reasonable.
It does seem reasonable. And isn't that annoying when you have beliefs that you've been raised with and all of a sudden you get smacked in the face and say, wow, I got to really rethink this whole issue. I remember when I was in Atlanta talking about this and I said in front of the church, you actually get married at City Hall. The whole place looked at me like, what are you talking about? They didn't understand that you were legally married when you paid for that marriage license. You formed a legal partnership, a legal corporation at that point. And they kept thinking that you had to wait for the priest to say you can kiss the bride and then you're married. No, you were actually married at the city hall when you bought that license. That's when the legal marriage was formed, and goes against what most people.
What technically isn't the marriage formed after it's performed and the certificate is filled out and filed?
That's when you.
Not
That's
when
when
it's
it.
issued?
That's when you pay for it and it's filed and stamped. That's when it's official. They can
It's been a
pronounce you
long
man and
time
wife
since
right
I've
there in
been
city hall.
I've only been married once, and it's been a very long time since I got married.
Yeah, just
But
call City Hall, you'll find out. You
okay,
get married, they could even produce. They can do a ceremony right there. The clerk can do a ceremony right there and pronounce you man and wife.
no, that's fair, but that's actually performing the ceremony. But I was under the impression that you were saying that as soon as the certificate is issued to you, that you're considered married, even though you haven't performed the ceremony.
That's correct. You are considered married even if you didn't perform the ceremony. Now, once again, if you're a Christian, you want to make it a biblical marriage per se, then you go into a church and you go through a ceremony. But the bottom line is you were married before that ceremony began, legally.
Here's the problem I have with that explanation, Richard. If you get a marriage license issued and you don't get married, you don't have to get divorced.
I think you might want to check the laws on that. Once you
Well,
form that marriage, there's ways you can divorce marriages very early on, but once you get that certificate, that is the legal entity. Like I tell people, you may get married in church, but you get divorced in court, not in church.
we agree there. You
Yeah,
get married in church. You don't get married in the
you may get married.
registrar's office when they're issuing the license unless they perform the ceremony, as you said.
You can go that route if you want. You can get married in church and then go down City Hall. But the bottom line is, if you go down City Hall first, you're married legally. Now, maybe not spiritually in your mind, or your religious belief. Maybe not spiritually, maybe
No,
not
I'm
biblically.
thinking in terms of legality.
Legalities,
But
justice issue.
but I respectfully disagree.
Okay,
If I go to court tomorrow, if my say God forbid my wife is dead, and I go to court to get a marriage license to remarry, there is no marriage. There is nothing to divorce if there's no ceremony performed. There's nothing filed on record. They just issued you a certificate that's blank, and it has to be signed and then recorded in the state logs before the marriage is
yeah, I'm
considered
talking about
legal.
an official when it's officially recorded. Like I said, when it's stamped. When I said stamped, I meant officially recorded.
Okay.
That's
Okay. I think it was a semantic difference
yeah,
in,
it
in
was.
making a mountain out of a molehill
Yeah,
because I thought you were saying issued and you're saying no when it's recorded. I
right.
agree. I agree. But
Okay,
that doesn't happen without a ceremony and then some officiant filling
right.
out the. Okay, we're on the same page.
Okay.
Even when we aren't agreeing, and I think we're disagreeing, we're actually still on the same page.
That disagreement's over.
Yeah, it was mostly just my confusion.
No, it was probably the way I said it as well, because people don't realize that in court, I'm sorry, at City Hall, when something is stamped and officially filed, that's the same thing that you were talking about, the official recording of the document. Up
It's
till that
like
point,
any
it's a
other.
blank piece of
It's
paper.
like any other contract at that
Right.
point.
Thank you for making me say it clearer also.
I
Boy, that's the biggest argument we've had.
I did. I told you. I promised that this wasn't going to be an adversarial type of a
Yeah.
situation. That I just wanted to understand what your position was better,
Yeah.
and I think I've gotten a lot clearer understanding. Still a little hesitant, but you make very good points about the legal necessity according to providing benefits. Otherwise, you're kind of being cruel and using the state to impose your cruelty by denying people something that they would receive otherwise if everything was fair and equal. And that's what we should strive for is fairness and equality and being kind and generous. And basically everything that just happened for the last 24 to 48 hours on my Facebook page when I lit the flame on this topic by
When I
posting
saw
that.
it, I knew. I said, "Oh no."
A lot of times I see it coming. When I post about John Calvin, I know the Calvin supporters are going to come out in force and roast me. When I post a joke about the flat earth, and I'm just really not seeing the flat earth having flown to Australia and seen moonshots and things of that nature. I just find it difficult to reconcile how the earth could have time zones and all these things that we know from simple observation and be flat. Because it seems to me the sun would be on in Australia and in the United States at the same time if the whole world was flat. It would all be daylight at the same time, it would all be dark at the same time. But that's just my 2 cents, and I didn't mean to get off on a flat earth crusade.
I find that discussion amazing.
This is the type of discussion that I like having, where we don't agree, or at least not to start. And through reading and talking, communicating, we've achieved a common understanding where I understand your position and I'm still stubbornly clinging in some respects to my position, but I'm respectful, very respectful of your position. And I do appreciate you giving me your time today and coming on here and discussing something that I think you wrote this 7 years ago or something like that.
I
And
don't even know how long ago it was.
it's not something that you wrote last week. I've asked you to come on and discuss this with very little notice and very little preparation, but I still think we had an interesting conversation. And I
I,
do thank you for it.
I appreciate it. And I thank you very much. I think it was a respectful conversation. Sometimes on Facebook, due to the speed with which we go through, or at least I go through Facebook posts, I sound a lot more abrupt and maybe even sometimes rude by some because I come in and I just make my points, boom, boom. And sometimes I realize when I go back and say, gee, that sounds confrontational when I didn't really mean to sound that way. But I tend to be, as in my writing shows, I'm very factual, not matter of fact. I don't put a lot of fluff into it if I don't mean to offend you and all that. I figure I should leave that to the person to figure out whether I'm being offensive or not. But I even made some comments probably in that you might have considered offensive in that particular thread.
I don't remember what you said per se. You did, in fairness, you did catch my attention
I did.
by being critical, but all that does is it makes me interested in having a conversation like this because I feel like those are the most interesting conversations, not something where somebody says, yes, I agree to everything that you say.
Yeah.
And
I appreciate your column very much. I do, your posts.
well, and also I would say that I tend to be pretty sarcastic myself. And,
Maybe
and
that's why I like them. No, some
so
of your comedy. One of the things I do sometimes for fun is I'll do some comedy. So I really appreciate comedy, and you post some good stuff.
thank you.
Good for a laugh. God
I,
knows we need some laughter in this world.
we do indeed. I look forward to talking with you again sometime, Richard.
All
It's
right.
been a pleasure today.
It's
Thank
been a
you.
pleasure too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.